In 1927, Charles Lindbergh electrified the world by flying solo from New York's Roosevelt Field to Le Bourget Airfield outside Paris, France. His flight triggered what was to become known as the Golden Age of Aviation, a period of intense experimentation and public interest that extended to the beginning of World War II. In spite of popular worldwide interest during this period, aviation was yet to make a political impact in America. Congress was preoccupied with the direction the nation's economy was headed. It had little interest in promoting aircraft development. While there were some large aircraft manufacturers, the cutting edge of aviation technology was often left to experimenters in small, struggling shops around the country. Theories were tested through trial and error. Engineers, with few guidelines to follow, tried innovative designs that pushed the boundaries of aircraft design to the limits as they tried to meet the challenge of speed and distance, sometimes with fatal results. One means of stimulating development, as well as increasing public interest, was the national air races held during these golden years. Companies like Bendix, Thompson, Aero, Ford, Goodyear, Shell, and many others offered prize money that kept the spirit of aviation development alive. Without the promise of cash awards and recognition for innovation and daring, it would have been unlikely that America would have been in a position in the air to tackle the air menace that was growing in Europe during the period. Of the many small companies building competition airplanes, one firm and one design stands out to this day. The Granville Brothers Aircraft Company of Springfield, Massachusetts, had a profound effect on aviation. Their successful GB racers captured the public's attention and the world's admiration at the time as the fastest planes ever built in America. The designs that came off their drawing boards were trendsetters, a streamlined shape that heavily influenced other designers of the period. They set the shape of several of America's great fighters during World War II. The GB racers that the Granvilles built in the early 30s captured the imagination of millions. To this day, the image of the stubby little planes typifies that golden era. Unfortunately, over the years, aviation history writers have been unkind to the enthusiastic and talented men who produced some of the most remarkable aircraft ever built. Their sensational tales of hard luck, recklessness, and death have blurred the record of the Granvilles and their associates. What you are about to hear is the story of the GB airplanes, told by the people who were there.
Crowds watching a real show today, starting with Jimmy Doolittle, the human bullet.
The little plane belongs to the Springfield Air Racing Association, built by the Granville brothers in Springfield. In the next few minutes, we expect to make an attempt on the world speed record.
The story of the creative genius behind the GB racers begins in New England in the late 1920s. Zantford Granville, eldest of 5 brothers from a Madison, New Hampshire farming family, had moved to Boston several years earlier and started an automobile repair garage.
Well, my older brother, Zantford, started the organization. He started in the garage business. He was a very good mechanic and sort of a self-taught engineer. He had his own garage business at the age of 19. He became interested in aviation soon thereafter, and he started learning to fly at the East Boston Airport. And he worked at the airport to pay for the flying time, and I believe he got his pilot's license in 1925.
Zantford had a flair for mechanical things, and he soon found himself repairing airplanes at the East Boston Airport.
He then brought his, next oldest brother, Tom, to Massachusetts to take over the garage so he could spend full time at the airport. Soon thereafter, he formed a company at the airport, which was called Granville Brothers Air Service. I joined him in 1927. We built a shop on the field on a truck chassis so we could move around because we weren't permitted to build a permanent structure. And we rented a basement of a shoe factory in which to do our major overhaul work. This went on for a year or two, and we gained quite a bit of experience overhauling the airplane of that day, and then decided that maybe we ought to build one of our own.
Zantford set up shop with his 4 brothers and coined the GB logo, which stood for the initials of Granville Brothers. Zantford was the guiding light and brought together an unusual array of talent. He marshaled the skills of his brothers and brought in top-notch engineering personnel to validate his creations. One of them, Bob Hall, was to play a pivotal role in the GB success.
He had been an engineer on Skyway's flying boat, and their boat was designed right in our office. We had a little office on Arlene Street in Boston in the corner of an abandoned shoe factory where we repaired airplanes. And Skyways had these 3 young fellows, all fresh out of college, that were designing the boat in our building, and we were building it. That was Bob Hall, Bob Air, and Bob Dexter.
Zantford had little formal education beyond the 8th grade, but was an intuitive engineer and worked well with Bob Hall. Zantford's innovative nature was evident from the very start in what was to become a continual string of improvements that would influence aviation design for decades.
And Zantford Granny, as we called him, designed this airplane, and we tried to introduce a lot of things and fixes for things that we felt were wrong with the aircraft of the day. And,
such as?
Well, for example, this airplane had flaps to lower the landing speed. We had releasable controls so the pilot could release the controls from the student in flight with just a twist of the stick. It had brakes, steerable brakes. It had a tail wheel. The top and bottom wings were interchangeable. The attachment fittings on the fuselage and various critical areas were equipped with universal joints to prevent serious damage. If a landing gear strut got bent, it wouldn't tear the fitting off the fuselage, and a lot of things like that we'd been repairing on other aircraft.
We had a sliding stick arrangement in it so 2 people could sit side by side without having a stick between their knees. And people used to fly an open cockpit in those days, and they could even use a robe in the wintertime to keep from freezing to death without interfering with the controls.
On May 3rd, 1929, at 5:30 in the morning, the new biplane was rolled out of the hangar.
We didn't want too many onlookers, so we assembled the airplane in the middle of the night and was ready to fly at 5:30 in the morning. And Granny took it off and made a flight around the field. The weather was extremely bad, but we were ready to fly and flew anyway. And it was very successful. And so then we started looking for a place to continue with our efforts with the hope to market the airplane.
Boston papers reported the GB Model P as the first successful aircraft built in that city. In late spring of 1929, Bob Granville sent letters to various cities in New England, trying to find someone interested in backing the fledgling company. They received an invitation from the 4 Tate brothers in Springfield, Massachusetts, to attend an air meet during the July 4th celebration. George, Harry, Frank, and James Tate operated a successful ice cream manufacturing business and had recently opened the Springfield Airport. Granny's plane caught the fancy of Lowell Bales, a barnstormer and part-time airline pilot operating out of Springfield, who was known for his flying skills. Bales was quite impressed with the plane, but he felt it needed a bit more power. At the time, The ship was powered by a Veli 55 horsepower, 5-cylinder radial engine. A larger engine made a marked improvement, and based on Bale's enthusiastic endorsement, the Tates offered to finance Zantford if he would move his operation from Boston to Springfield.
At the time that we moved in, it was the remains of a dance hall. It had a nice hardwood floor, which was nice to work on. It was just an open building. And the first thing we did was set up a line shaft, supposed to have power to run the tools, and brought some carpenters in and built some offices along the front of it. And it started purchasing a few second-hand tools.
Mindless of the worsening economic situation in the country, Granville Brothers Aircraft enthusiastically began building planes based on the Model P design. They hired Bob Hall from Boston and made him chief engineer. He set about preparing the Model P for certification by the U.S. Department of Commerce. Eight of the biplanes sold easily, and the little company was on its way. But their optimism was to come to an abrupt end. In November, the 1929 stock market crash came. The aviation industry was one of the hardest hit. At the time, airplanes were more a plaything of the rich. There was little interest in buying airplanes. Times were hard.
I think this is what led us into the racing end of the business. At about that time, I think early 30, we heard about the All-American Derby. I think it was sponsored by the Cirrus Engine Company. There was quite a lot of money for the prizes involved, and some of us had been toying with the idea of building a small plane for a plaything anyway, and we went on with that to build a plane for this Cirrus American Derby.
Hoping at a chance to win some of the prize money being offered, Bob Hall encouraged Granny to build a plane specifically for the Cirrus Derby. The Model X began to take form. Driven by a Cirrus 90 horsepower engine, the ship had a top speed of 140 miles per hour. Lowell Bales was chosen to fly the Model X, and everyone's hopes ran high.
It was a long, really tough race, about 55, I think it was 5,541 miles they called it, and it was almost completely around the country, the United States.
It was really, it could be called a reliability tour, couldn't it?
Yes, that was what it was really for, was to prove the reliability of Cirrus engines. Cirrus put up the money for the racing. And there was quite a few standard airplanes in it, like 3 or 4 Great Lakes biplanes, for instance. But Command Air built a special airplane for it.
Lee Gelbach in the Command Air finished first, but the GB Model X with Lowell Bales aboard finished second and first among what was to become a production airplane called the GB Sportster.
The Command Air, but I guess it was kind of tough to fly too, and it was a little bit faster, I guess, than the GB. But they fought it out between them. They were ahead of everybody else all through the race, both of them. Sometimes one ahead and sometimes the other.
I understand they were good friends, Gelbach and Bales.
Yeah. Yeah, they were excellent friends. 2 mighty, wonderful pilots. And Bales really advertised the GB quite a bit, because every night when he came in to land, he would put on a little aerobatic show before he sat down. Gelbach was usually too tired to do that, and I don't know whether he could have done it with a rocket anyway or not, but...
Oh, you mean as Bales hopped from city to city, he would do that?
Yeah.
Oh, during the race, during the
Yeah, they had a schedule from city to city to city, day by day, and when he came in to land, why, he just come down to the airport and roll her up over a few times.
Oh, I didn't know that. Well...
And that really, a lot of people saw it and liked it.
I know when Bales returned, he landed at Westfield. so that the Springfield Flyers could come over and escort him home.
That's right.
That really put the name GB on the aviation map, don't you think?
Yes, it did. Certainly did. Also Lowell Bales. Everybody knew Lowell Bales in the country after that.
Were you able to sell the Sportsters? In other words, were there enough wealthy individuals to
Well,
keep you going?
There was enough to sell a few. The first two, Bales bought himself. He bought the ship that he flew in the Derby. He loved it, and as soon as he got back, he acquired it, and then he joined forces with Roscoe Britton, and they went on barnstorming tours all over the East Coast, and using that to draw the crowds with. Bales could even bring it in on its back and roll it and land it, and that drew a crowd.
And anywhere you drew a crowd, you, of course, made more famous the name GB.
Yeah.
Everybody came to know what they were.
We, at Boston, we took care of Harvard Flying Club's airplane, and two young fellows who flew them a lot was George Rand and Harold Moon, and they both came to Springfield and bought Sportsters immediately after that. So that was our first two production Sportsters.
And these two fellows weren't from Springfield, so they took their Sportsters out of the Springfield area, is that right?
Rand was from New York, and Moon was from Philadelphia.
The inline Sportsters continued to evolve. Some fitted with Cirrus engines, others with the 125 horsepower Monasco. The Model D rolled out in 1931 and sported a fully faired landing gear which was to become standard on all future GB aircraft. But Granny and Hall felt the real future lay in a radial engine design. Without exception, the Warner-powered Sportster series brought favorable comments from their owners regarding handling and performance. Zantford Granville was always thinking of ways to improve his planes and thought a two-seat version of the popular Sportster might appeal to the commercial buyer with a need for high-speed transport. The new ship was designed to handle a range of radial engines, and the first plane was fitted with the big 450 horsepower Pratt & Whitney Wasp engine. Designated the Model Y, the first senior Sportster proved to be everything Granny hoped for. The powerful two-seater was painted white with bright red trim. One pilot who was attracted to this superb ship was Maud Tate, daughter of James, one of the brothers who owned Springfield Airport. Maud was the first woman in all of New England to hold a transport license. And in 1929, flying an autogyro, she set an unofficial altitude record for women of 16,500 feet. Maud loved to fly. She was soon drawn from her teaching job in nearby East Longmeadow to fly full-time. The Depression dragged on. Money remained scarce. To keep the business alive, Granny and Bob Hall began eyeing the prize money being offered at America's biggest aerial show, the National Air Races, coming up in Cleveland in just a few months.
It was quite a lot of money, the National Air Races, and Granny and Bob Hall, between them, decided we ought to have some of it. So, actually, when it was really decided to build the city of Springfield, we only had a little over 2 months before the race.
As good as the Sportsters were, Granny and Hall both felt something different was needed. What came off the drawing boards was the Model Z, designed to excel at one job: go fast and win races. The Z carried through the radial engine design of the successful senior Sportster. The setback cockpit created an optical illusion, and many critics claimed the fuselage was too short for good control and that the tail surfaces were too small. The wings used a relatively new airfoil designed by an aeronautical engineer named Monk, who published his theories in a series of articles in Aero Digest magazine in the early 30s. Hall chose a thinned reflex design which limited the travel of the center of lift as the wing passed through the air at various angles of attack. This also allowed the use of minimum tail surfaces to reduce weight and drag. The same airfoil design elements are used to a degree on the French-British Concorde and most Delta Wing aircraft today. With only 6 weeks before the race and money tight, everyone plunged into the project with enthusiasm. For the engine, Bob Hall drew on his contacts at Pratt & Whitney, at that time a small engine manufacturer in nearby Hartford. Pratt & Whitney was impressed with Hall's ideas. They were also eager to publicize their engines, and in the spirit of cooperation for their mutual benefit, agreed to loan the Granvilles a supercharged Wasp Junior engine.
This was a Wasp Junior, or often known as the R985, an engine normally at that time of 300 horsepower, but which was allowed to go to 535 horsepower.
Pratt & Whitney would grow into a world leader in aircraft engines over the coming years. During World War II, they would provide over 50% of the power for Allied air forces around the globe. Money was still needed to run the business, and Bob Hall and Granny formed what was called the Springfield Air Racing Association. The plan was to raise money from businessmen, as well as private investors in the Springfield area.
You see, when the Springfield Air Racing Association had to be formed in order to raise money to build this airplane. I designed the airplane in the morning and go out in the afternoon and pound the pavement to all the big companies in Springfield and say, hey, come on, buy some shares, $100 a share. And sold about $5,000 worth, which was enough to build this airplane. And the reason it was enough is because we got so much from the manufacturers without having to pay for it, like the engine. Pratt & Whitney lent us the engine. Curtis Propeller built us a special propeller, absolutely custom designed and built for this airplane. No charge. We got the wheels, tires, brakes, flying wires, some of the instruments, all for nothing, without which we couldn't possibly have done it for the money that we were able to raise by the Springfield Air Racing Association.
In 6 short weeks, the Model Z was completed. The little black and yellow ship, christened the City of Springfield, was ready for its maiden flight. Saturday, August 22nd, 1931. It was Bob Hall's 26th birthday. The plan was to take off from Springfield and land at nearby Bowles Field, just across the Connecticut River. Hall wasn't sure about the plane's landing speed, and to be safe, he wanted to use Bowles' longer runway.
It didn't go very fast, you know. I didn't push it one bit the first flight. All I wanted to do was to get it in the air and get it back on the ground safely. So I didn't open it up at all. I think what somebody said it was like 150, 175 miles an hour is all the fast I went on that first flight. But I flew it long enough so that I knew that it was perfectly all right, and went over to Bowles Field and landed it. And then we started finding out a few things that had to be fixed a little bit. I thought it was a fine flying airplane. I really had no problems with it at all whatsoever. Of course, it was very light it was light on the rudder. So light that in order to feel it, I flew in my stocking feet after the first flight.
The Thompson Trophy Race, the premier event of the National Air Races in Cleveland, was just days away. It was a 100-mile dash around pylons for aircraft of unlimited engine size. Bob Hall took off for Cleveland by way of Buffalo, where he and Lowell Bales would take turns flying the Z in the races over Labor Day. Bales had invested $500 to help build the Z in return for the right to fly it in the Thompson Trophy Race. It was an exciting time for the Granvilles.
It was very exciting. When we got there, we had 2 airplanes with about 2 feet of wing cut off of them, which we had to get flying. And we had, of course, we had a few men there before I got there. Mark and Ed, I guess, were both there. And Hall had, in one of the races, Hall had clipped a water tower and took about 3 feet off the end of the senior wing, which had to be repaired overnight. And almost the same thing happened to one of the sportsters when somebody taxed it into it.
How did the public take to this stubby little plane of unusual design that made every military aircraft in the world obsolete the moment it took off?
A lot of people didn't believe that a low-wing airplane could take a tight pylon turn, and they figured the biplanes would have a big advantage on that, and everybody thought Doolittle would probably win the race. And it's possible he might have had he had engine trouble. They were very close on speed. Doolittle had a good ship, there's no doubt about that, and he's a great pilot.
Jimmy Doolittle was just one of many who took part in the 1931 races, whose lives would be brought together in a more intense competition of global dimensions, World War II. Jimmy Doolittle would lead the raid on Tokyo and bolster Allied morale in the early days of the war. Bob Hall would test fly and contribute significantly to the design of some of the best fighter planes for our Navy. General Ira Ika, who, among other aviation achievements, would head up the U.S. 8th Air Force in England during World War II. And there was German aerobatic performer and World War I ace Ernst Udet, who would become known as the father of the Luftwaffe, Germany's emerging air force. At Cleveland, the Z caught Udet's eye, and he expressed his admiration of the little plane to Bob Hall in a rather unusual way. Udet never fully accepted Hitler's image of the New World Order and would fall into disfavor with the German government and commit suicide shortly after the war began. The performance of the Model Z was nothing short of sensational. In each of the 5 races it was entered in, the little black and yellow ship walked away from the pack to take the checkered flag. In the straightaway Shell Speed Dash, sponsored by Shell Oil, Bales set a new American speed record of 267.34 miles an hour. Then, with the Thompson Trophy race just hours away, engine trouble developed.
The NEA set up that particular morning, which was the same day that Thompson was going to be flown, for him to run his attempt at the world speed record, which was a very poor day to do it. And he flew several laps at full throttle, and he had motor trouble and had to land. And he brought it in. Pratt Whitney had at least one, I think 2 good mechanics there. And my brother Mark and those boys from Pratt Whitney went right to work on it, tear it down. And they had at least 1 cylinder and 2 or 3 pistons that were ruined.
And they had to change those right before race time. Right
before the race. It was happened about 10 o'clock in the morning. The race come off, I don't know exactly, 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Pratt Whitney had the material there to fix it with, and had some good men, and they put it back together, and they fired her up about noontime, and Mark sat right in the cockpit and run that thing in from the time that it was ready to start until Bales got into it to wheel it out on the field.
Yeah, I've read that. They never shut her down. After they put the new pistons in, they never shut her down until Bales left the starting line.
And Bales said she picked up revs every single lap all the way through the race, no problems whatever.
The Granville entourage made out well at the 1931 National Air Races. The Model Z won 5 races in all. Meanwhile, Bob Hall finished 4th in the Thompson Trophy race in the Model Y. Maud Tate set a new ladies' speed record in the Model Y by winning the Aero Trophy, the premier event for women pilots. Another grand achievement for one of the country's outstanding aviatrix. Springfield went wild as their heroes came home.
It sure did.
They cleaned up, and
I forgot exactly, but I think it was up around $17,000 in all, and had the senior sports still loaded the front cockpit full of trophies when we came home to Springfield with them. Yeah, it really was a big thing for a little outfit. I remember it very distinctly. The airplanes all come in, and there was a mob at Springfield Airport, and then the city put on a banquet that night. It was really big doings. Everybody that was able to made a speech. Granny made a pretty good speech, giving the credit to the boys who worked their heads off to get the airplane built in time.
On a practical note, the more than $17,000 of prize money, a very tidy sum in the 1930s, assured Granville Brothers Aircraft would remain in business. It also meant a 100% dividend paid to the jubilant investors of the Springfield Air Racing Association. In spite of the GB's success, no one had money to buy airplanes. In order to keep busy, Granny took the opportunity to explore several design concepts. One of them was a canard, or tail-first design. Granny's design was influenced by Germany's Focke-Wulf Ante, a twin-engine canard with tricycle landing gear. He dubbed his version the Ascender, notable as a very rare example of an American design of this type during the period. A design concept that's being explored in great depth today. With business slack and no end to their money problems, Bob Hall decided to go on his own. He left the Granvilles to form his own company just across the river at Bowles Airport in Agawam, Massachusetts.
Bob was an ambitious young man and a very capable young man, and he decided that he would go on his own and do the things that he wanted to do. He and Granny didn't always want to do the same things, and so it was just a matter of two smart young fellows separating and going on their own.
Bob Hall designed and built 2 planes for wealthy sportsman pilots, and flew his Springfield Bulldog in the 1932 National Air Races, but finished just out of the money. Hall would go on to Grumman to work as an engineering test pilot. His influence on the design of the Wildcat, Hellcat, and Avenger planes that distinguished themselves during World War II can be traced to his experience with the GB racers. Hall retired from Grumman as Vice President of Engineering in 1970.
Lowell Bales became ambitious and decided that he would try for the new world land plane speed record, which was held by France. Pratt & Whitney cooperated by lending Granville's, or the Springfield Air Race Association Incorporated, a 750 horsepower engine, which went into the Model Z.
Yeah.
Can you tell us anything about that?
I remember we put it in, and Bales test stopped it, and after his test stop, Granny, who always was a very conservative man, he asked Lowell to take it up, well up, and find out whether it could take the beating or not before he done any racing with it or made any world speed attempts. And Bales took it and was gone for a couple hours, and he come back all smiles, and he said, "She'll hold together. You don't have to worry a bit about that."
Maud Tate also decided to try for the women's record in the Model Y.
I wasn't fortunate enough to break it by enough to establish a new world's record. I missed it by a very, very tiny bit.
Who held the record at that time?
Amelia Earhart.
Maud Tate missed establishing a new women's record by just 1/100th of a second. Discouraged and pressed to return for her upcoming wedding, Maud dropped out of the trials. During this same period, Bales flew the required 4 passes over the timed course. On one of these passes, he was clocked at 314 miles per hour. However, on another of the official runs, the timing equipment on the ground malfunctioned, and his speed could not be officially recorded. In early December, Bales returned to Detroit for another attempt at the record. weather was raw and the air extremely turbulent the afternoon of December 5th as Bales set up for his record speed runs. Adding to his discomfort was the dangerously outdated regulation, limiting speed runs to below 50 meters, 164 feet. Acceptable perhaps for earlier times, but not for the faster aircraft of the day.
Right nearly, he was just approaching the marker when she seemed to explode, and Bales was, a wing collapsed, and it made 4 complete snap rolls so fast that nobody could see them with the naked eye. It hit right in the middle of the field at Wayne County Airport. The engine come out of it, rolled just like a wheel, the whole length of field. Bales' body went out of it, and it was just a flaming mass. They had a movie camera set up at that pylon, and they had taken beautiful pictures of it. They had absolutely clear pictures of it, and Granny run those pictures over and over and over trying to find out what the cause was.
Granny theorized that the gas cap came loose and hit the windshield, blinding Bales and causing him to lose control. Another widely held theory at the time, however, was that there must have been a fracture or other stress-related defect that caused the failure of the right wing due to low-altitude turbulence.
And there's been a lot of people said that Granny only cared about speed and had no thought for the safety of his pilots, but that was absolutely a fabrication, because nobody ever tried harder to build an airplane that a man wouldn't get killed in than Granny did.
The accident triggered what was to become a long series of generally inaccurate articles bent on sensationalizing the event and other mishaps the GBs experienced as time went on.
Of course, the public says, oh, the airplane's bad airplane, crashed, you know, somebody got killed. They don't always look into all the facts, unfortunately. And I feel the GB's got to have an unfair reputation.
This literary misconduct was criticized by Walter Boyne, former director of the National Air and Space Museum, now retired. He wrote,
"The Model Z snapped over and smashed into the ground in a rolling ball of flame, and generations of hack journalists were given a tedious myth to embroider."
Crushed by the loss of a close personal friend, Zantford, with a heavy heart, tried to pull the business together. At about the same time, an aeronautical engineer named Howell Pete Miller joined the Granville brothers. Granny worked with Pete as well as he had with Bob Hall, and the two set their vision on the 1932 races, and not one but 2 new ships based on broad refinements of the Model Z design. Both planes would be physically similar. The R-1 was intended strictly for pylon racing and short speed dashes. The R-2, with a smaller engine and greater fuel capacity, was targeted for the Bendix cross-country long-distance race. Popular racers of the day still favored the sleek, narrow fuselage of the inline design. Miller carried through the bulky shape of the Model Z, molding the fuselage around the big Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines, enclosing them in a cowling designed to enhance cooling and reduce drag. He adapted the teardrop shape in seeking to lower drag. The maximum diameter was set about 1/3 of the length of the body. The efficiency of the concept was later confirmed in wind tunnel tests.
Well, I think all the people in the racing field pretty much had the same type of spirit, but there's one thing about the Granvilles. Their airplanes were really engineered. Yes, I think it's Zantford Granville is the real, credited as the real designer. He's the one that laid it out and the design philosophy and so forth. But then he hired an engineering group such as Robert Hall on the City of Springfield and Pete Miller on the others to do the engineering. They were all stress and analyzed. They built wind tunnels models and took them down to New York University and ran them through the wind tunnel. They knew the flight characteristics of those planes. Yes, they were hot, fast airplanes, not made for Piper Cub pilots to fly.
The fuselage was constructed of aircraft steel tubing streamlined with plywood formers and spruce stringers. The fin and rudder was another deviation from accepted practice. The rudder was nearly 12 inches thick at the hinge line, providing adequate control at stall speed and a soft feel at high speeds. The cockpit was placed just ahead of the stabilizer for aircraft balance and streamlining. Pilot safety was uppermost to Miller and Granny, and two means of escape were provided: a quick-release cockpit cover and a small door in the side of the fuselage. Another innovation was the use of a streamlined locking tail wheel in place of a skid. Pete Miller respected Lee Gelbach's opinions and incorporated many of his suggestions regarding the control characteristics of the R planes. By this time, noted long-distance flyer Russell Boardman owned controlling interest in the Springfield Air Racing Association. Boardman decided he would have the honor of flying number 11.
The morning the airplane was ready, Boardman was ready, and he was a very cool customer. He went out and stood with his parachute on and spent an hour letting the news people take pictures and so forth, and he didn't appear to be any more excited about flying it than he would have been flying a Cub. And he took it off perfectly and flew at the bowls and made a perfect landing. And was very happy with the airplane. The only thing he said that on steep turns, she needs a little more rudder and fin. Granny and Pete decided immediately to put that on before it was flown again. So we did that job right in the hangar at Bowles, and then the other one hadn't come out of the hangar yet at Springfield, and the job was done before it even came out of the shop. I was at Bowles finishing the tail work, and was told that when it was ready to fly to column back there, which I did after the open dried. We didn't bother to put the numbers on it or anything. We were just going to fly it as soon as it was ready. And Boardman had his car there, and he was going to drive over. But Granny said to him, "Why don't you take the Sportster and go with that?"
Boardman took off in the Sportster and climbed at an unusually steep angle. He fell into a spin at an altitude too low to recover and crashed into the woods just off the airport boundary. Boardman was severely injured. The crash was attributed to his habit of abrupt pull-ups on takeoff, a practice that was later to cost him his life.
He was quite a few months before he was able to fly again. The airplane was a complete washout. Why it didn't kill him, nobody knows. He went right down through the trees and into the woods and into the ground.
World-renowned race pilot and MIT aeronautical engineering graduate Jimmy Doolittle was testing his entry for the races, a layered super solution fitted with a newly installed retractable landing gear. The gear malfunctioned, and the plane was damaged on landing. Doolittle, one of the world's best pilots, was without a plane. Halfway across the country sat the world's fastest plane, the GEE Bee, with no pilot.
As soon as Boardman was able to talk, Randy went down to his home down on the Cape after a few days, and he stayed down there a couple of days with him, and they apparently talked the situation over and to find out who we wanted to get for pilots. And I don't think up to that time they even had a pilot for number 7. But anyway, Granny came up with Lee Gelbach and Jimmy Doolittle. He flew into Springfield first and picked up Granny and Mark, and they flew over the Bowles with the Shell Lockheed that he was having to fly in. and they went over the airplane for an hour or so between them, and then they took it out, gassed it up. With no further ado, he just took off and headed west and waited to hear from him. Less than 2 hours later, we got a telegram from him, and it had just a few words on it. It said, "Landed Cleveland, okay." And that's all it said.
With Doolittle handling the R-1, Granny could turn his attention to the Bendix race and the R-2. Lee Gelbach had successfully competed in the 1931 Bendix. Would he fly for the Granvilles in 1932? The answer was yes. The Bendix Trophy race originated in Burbank, California, and coordinated with the national air races by ending in Cleveland, where the pilots could enter additional events. Gelbach made the long flight in the R-2 from Springfield, Massachusetts to the West Coast without incident, and prepared for the cross-country dash to Cleveland.
He was all on his own that year with number 7, and he got it back as far as Illinois, doing very nicely. He was making good time and figured on winning it. And somewhere over Illinois, he began to get a spray of oil on his windshield, and he sat down at the Army base at, I think, Rantoul or something of that nature, to find out what the trouble was, and he found he had a cracked oil line, and there was no facilities for fixing it. Oh. And he got some oil and filled his tank brimming full, took the cockpit cover off and left it there, and took off again and went on into Cleveland.
Nursing the airplane all the way, Gelbach and the R-2 dropped hopelessly out of competition and were the last of the Bendix entries to arrive in Cleveland. Now the Granvilles turned their attention to the Shell Speed Dash. The straightaway high-speed sprint was a qualifying event for the upcoming feature, the Thompson Trophy race.
In the next few minutes, we expect to make an attempt on the world speed record.
Crowds watching a real show today, starting with Jimmy Doolittle, the human bullet, a new record, 293 miles an hour.
And Jimmy set a new world land plane speed record in the Shell Speed Dash at 296 miles per hour, more than 10 miles per hour faster than his closest challenger. His win brought the title back to America from France, which had held the record for the past 8 years. Winning the Shell Speed Dash earned Doolittle the tidy sum of $1,575. He also won the Lowell Bales Memorial Trophy, sponsored by the citizens of Springfield, and awarded to flyers setting a new American land plane speed record. Now, it was on to the main event, the race for the Thompson Trophy. The big GBs waited at the starting line.
Bob Hall and the two or three Waddell Williams ships were the real competition, and they were all up in about close to the same speeds. There was really some tight competition with everything except Doolittle. Doolittle had enough more speed over everybody so that he flew high, wide, and handsome, kept out of the mess, and won very easily. The real battle was between Gelbach and Hall and the Waddells. And Gelbach flew a beautiful race, right down low to the ground, got every drop there was out of the engine.
Doolittle won the Thompson Trophy and $4,500, hands down, clocking in at just over 252 miles per hour, another new record. Lee Gelbach finished 5th in the R2 and pocketed another $500. Jimmy Doolittle's double measure of success brought fame and glory once again to Springfield and the GB name. Unbeknownst at the time, this was to be Doolittle's last race. He intended to retire. This series of shots dramatically shows the stability that was built into these classic airplanes. Because of conflicting runway traffic, Doolittle is shown in the R-1 aborting a landing attempt. While at low airspeed and altitude, he executes a tricky go-around with ease. Extensive wind tunnel testing had proved that the aircraft was completely stable at all speeds, attributed to the design engineering that went into these magnificent machines. Doolittle heaped praise on the GB and Granville Brothers aircraft, summing up his personal feelings in a note mailed to Zantford on September 7th, just a few days after the National Air Races.
Dear Granny, just a note to tell you that the big GB functioned perfectly in both the Thompson Trophy and the Shell Speed Dash. With sincere best wishes for your continued success, IMS Forever, Jim.
And so the high point of the 1932 aviation year came to a close, with the GBs pushing their country to the forefront of world aviation. It also closed a chapter in the GB story. But never again would these beautiful aircraft grace the skies without being hounded by ill fortune and a series of unfortunate accidents caused by pilot error or lack of experience in high-performance aircraft. The death knell came in 1934, when Zantford, delivering a Sportster to a client in the South, was landing at Spartansburg, South Carolina. Granny crashed and was killed as he pulled up suddenly to avoid hitting an airport workman who had wandered into his path on the runway. That accident sealed the fate of Granville Brothers aircraft and also signaled the end of a glorious period in American aviation history. Most of the players in the GB story are gone. The Springfield Airport is no longer, replaced by a shopping center. And yet, around the world, the presence of the GBs lives. In the commercial world, the engineering genius and innovative daring of the GBs is an integral fabric of the aircraft of today.
One of the best times of my life, I'll tell you. Because it was really gratifying to be able to do what I wanted to do, was design airplanes. And I had no interference.
And Granny was a great leader. And I enjoyed my few years with the Granville Brothers. And I'll never forget them.